Hello and good evening. Welcome. It's wonderful to see the panelists arrive on screen and to know that all of you have joined us for this art and conversation. My name is Beth Finch, and I am the head curator at the Colby College Museum of Art. It is an honor and a pleasure to welcome everyone here this evening. If you are joining us and would like to use closed captions, those are available at the bottom of your screen. So the Art and Conversation series brings together visiting artists, students, and I would say lifelong students, scholars, museum staff, and community experts for discussions about exhibitions, collections, and projects of the Colby College Museum of Art and its Lunder Institute for American Art. It's a program for anyone interested in learning about art and engaging with key issues of our time. This iteration of Art and is uniquely special, and I think it fair to say dear to many hearts, because it was inspired by and is dedicated to the extraordinary spirit that was and is Karen Wentworth. Naeem will have more to say about his work with Karen, but as a starting point for our conversation, I can note that Karen curated a major aspect of Naeem's current exhibition entitled Grace that is on view at the Colby Museum now. And the word chosen for the exhibition suited Karen well. She lived and breathed grace, and she invited all of us to do so as well. We had hoped to gather in person for this program when we realized that the weather would not cooperate and we needed to transition to a virtual format. I was reminded of a moment during the organization of the exhibition when I had to tell Naeem and Karen that a group of artworks that they had identified for the installation could not be available to them due to light exposure limits to the rules we follow here at the museum. It was unfortunate, and to me, it felt somehow absurd, the contrast between the museum's rules dedicated to the long-term care and what Karen sought to express in the here and now, and knowing that she had limited time to do so. But she responded with tremendous grace and with equanimity and good humor. And we moved on and produced a beautiful exhibition that was shaped in a large degree through her vision for it. The connector for everyone on screen tonight, and many of you joining us in the audience, is Naeem Mohaiemen, whose collaborative research flowed from the Lunder Institute for American Art into the Colby Museum's galleries. And we're just so grateful and honored to have had the opportunity to work with Naeem and to have him here with us this evening. The exhibition that he and Karen realized will be on view until April 23rd. We're going to drop a link in the chat to information on it for those who haven't had a chance to see it and may be able to do so before it closes. I will briefly introduce the main participants in this conversation with the understanding that everyone attending is of course part of this event too. Toward the end of our time together at about 6:45, we will shift to the Q&A period. So to participate in that, please add your questions and comments at any time to the Q&A feature. It's also at the bottom of your screen. So turning to the introductions, I will begin with the connector in this story this evening. Naeem Mohaiemen was born in London in 1969 and grew up in Tripoli, Libya, and Dhaka, Bangladesh. He combines photography, films, archives, and essays to research many forms of utopia and dystopia, and that can occur in families, borders, architecture, and uprisings. He holds a PhD in anthropology from Columbia University, where he is Associate Professor of Visual Arts. Mohaiemen exhibits his work internationally, and his artworks are well represented in museum collections. Naeem was also the 2021 Lunder Institute Senior Fellow and the inaugural recipient of the Alfonso Ossorio Creative Production Grant, which supported the research that contributed to his current exhibition. And I think we're going to add a link to Naeem's website to the chat there. Daisy Desrosiers is director and chief curator of the Gun Gallery at Kenyon College. And it's just such a delight to be back with Daisy. And I'm sad that you weren't able to travel to Waterville for this, but we'll find another moment. She was previously the inaugural director of artist programs at the Lunder Institute for American Art at the Colby Museum. Daisy is an internationally recognized curator and art historian, and her research encompasses many subjects, but she has worked on the history of sugar and the politics of translation. And there's an extraordinary, it looks extraordinary, I have not seen it, but at the Gun Gallery presently, there's an exhibition called Sympathy for the Translator, and we're going to drop a link to the chat in it for that. It looks like a tremendous project. Maple Razsa is an associate professor of global studies at Colby College. He is committed to using text, images, and sound to embody lived experience and the political imaginations of contemporary social movements. His films, including Maribor Uprisings, Occupation, a film about the Harvard living wage sit-in, and Bastards of Utopia have shown in festivals around the world. Sam Scott graduated from Colby College in 2022 as a Lunder Institute research assistant supervised by Daisy. Sam worked closely with Naeem during the first phase of Naeem's Lunder Institute fellowship. At Colby, Sam was an English major and with a creative writing focus, and he minored in philosophy. After graduating, he moved to Virginia to teach English and math to neurodivergent students, and he joins us from Virginia this evening. Yen Zwan also graduated from Colby College in 2022, and as a curatorial intern, Yen worked closely with Naeem and me during the exhibition development stage of the project. At Colby, Yen was a biology and psychology double major and a frequent worker with us, as you can see, through her research assistant role and her curatorial internship. As a Colby graduate, she is currently working at Colby in its Memory and Language Lab, where her research is focusing on understanding cognitive aging. With that, we transition to the slides, and I turn things over to Naeem to say a few words about Karen Wentworth, after which we will step back in time a bit to the period of his Lunder Institute fellowship. So I'm going to share screens here. Just...
Thank you, Beth, for that lovely introduction and for bringing us all together this evening. Of course, it would have been lovely to be in person and looking out onto the room, but we also said, I think 2 days ago, thank God there is Zoom, so we could still hold the event in spite of the impending or already arrived snowstorm in Maine. There is a slight bit of deja vu in having the event on Zoom, because at the very beginning of the fellowship, when I was working with Daisy, we were hit by a different storm, which is the pandemic, and no weather reports related to that. And Daisy and I and others would keep saying, well, any day now, I'm going to be able to come and we can start. And as we waited, eventually we did one of the inaugural programs on Zoom as Daisy and I and others got used to the new normal. But in this case, Zoom is a benefit in allowing us to be together in spite of the inclement weather. Later on in this session, we are going to hear from Daisy about the antecedents of this project, and from Sam about earlier strands of research that gave us interesting knowledge but did not necessarily make it into the show, and from Jan as to how we came across Karen. So I will maybe go just directly to a little bit about my relationship with Karen Wentworth. Karen. It's quite strange in a public event to speak about her in the past tense, because not only was she full of this intense spirit and will to live and to continue doing things for the time that she had, but I think after some time of working with her and knowing her and becoming friends with her, you also start thinking, well, we're just going to continue like this. And when the exhibition opened, the exhibition that was influenced in large part by Karen's life as somebody who had chosen the path of death with dignity, and it was very much an exhibition about how she chose to live her life once she had made the decision that when the end comes, it'll be under my control. There were all these moments of serendipity that were happening as we became friends and as we started working with Beth and others at Colby College. It started at the beginning with Karen being one person within a horizon of people we were talking to around the idea of end of life preparation or lack of preparation. We wanted to contrast between, let's say, Maine, where now there is the option through this law to choose your last days, with other situations where that choice doesn't exist for various reasons, including legal. And at some point, Karen is such an intensely compelling personality, educator, activist, and photographer, that it became clear that we just wanted to make an exhibition about Karen and just stay there and not go on to other stories. And so we worked together on this exhibition that's now at Colby College, in which there is the centerpiece, which is a video about her life, about her last 1 year, elements of her preparation. And then the center room, which you can actually see in the image behind me, is a collection of works from Colby College's museum collection, selected by Karen in conversation with Beth. So the centerpiece of my show is actually Karen's show, her choices. The exhibition opened on November 11th, which is her birthday. And so, it was a dual opening and birthday party. And I remember at some point saying, like a day or so later, Karen, the next thing in the programming is going to be that we will do a panel discussion in the spring. And I think February was already in the offing. And I remember Karen said something about, oh, it'll be nice to be there. And then just kind of paused and didn't say but just said, well, let's see. And as those of you who followed Karen's story in newspapers and elsewhere or in Colby College's bulletins will know, her end came in January 12th. It's kind of part of her life and our relationship with her that, I myself have all these wishes. If only she could have been here tonight. That's why I said it's hard to talk about her in the past tense. If only she could be here through the show and be here on an ongoing basis. But I always was struck by how much inner peace she had, while all around her, there might be somebody like myself who might say, oh, but we just got to know each other. You have to, stay around and we have to watch more films together or whatever. But she had her own internal sense of calm of, I have decided on a plan and I will make the decision when it makes sense to say goodbye in the most dignified way possible. And that, I think, is perhaps the most moving part of my interactions with her. If we can go to the next slide, we might see. So this is actually an image that was just published about a week ago in the Maine Monitor and also Bangor Daily News. Just Karen with her, that pouch is the preparation for end of life steps. If we go to the next slide, I think there's a picture of, yeah, this is a picture of Karen with Allison, her daughter, an earlier picture, and then another one taken by the Bangor Daily News. This is her family. This is for whom she continued to live. Allison, her daughter, had a child, and she said to me at some point, well, I knew there was a reason I have to stay around because I have to stay around for my child. For those who haven't seen the exhibition, I suppose I should say this. The way that end of life process works is that you have gone through something by which medical science has told you there is not more to do. And that's the point at which you make the decision. And Karen was given a diagnosis. And what makes her life extraordinary in some ways is she was given a diagnosis of maybe 6 months to a year, and she stayed on with us for almost 4 years. So there was this way of always something new happening, and she would say, oh, this is why I'm staying on. She would say those things. Could we see the next slide? And that's Charlie, her partner, with whom I also spent a lot of time. If you see the video at Colby College, you'll see she has this whole conversation with which I connected, which was very much about, I have to choose to stay on in the world as long as I can be a functional person, bringing joy and conversation to others. But when that's not the case, I don't want to be here, and I want to choose. We really connected over the fact that she was a photographer, and I started teaching a class on digital photography last semester for the first time, because Columbia formerly had a very analog photography focused photography teaching system. And Karen was taking these photography classes at the same time. And so we got into this relationship where the exhibition had already opened, but I would talk to her every week about what I was going to teach. And then she would look at my slides and say, that's too difficult, or that sounds right, and I want to be in this class. So she became my teaching coach in all sorts of ways. It's just one of the ways that she was a quite extraordinary person, facing the end of life, but at the same time, finding new ways to be alive and alert, and not defined by her illness. Maybe I'll stop there, and I'll come back to it, of course, as we talk more. I think there might be one more slide from this is also from the Bangor News. This is from her memorial service, which included music chosen by her for the memorial service. And as you would see in the film, the burial site, which is a burial site for Karen and her mother, which was a dual burial done on the same day in January, was all chosen by Karen. So she chose even how she will be remembered, at least in this natural burial ground. I'll pause there and back to Beth.
Thank you, Naeem. So the platform on which you built your collaboration with Karen began with your fellowship at the Lunder Institute for American Art, and Daisy's role as Director of Artists Programs leading your fellowship. So Daisy, I'd love to hear how you approached your work with Naeem in this context, and in light of your knowledge of, interest in artist communities. And let me know when you want slides.
Hi, good evening, everyone. It's so wonderful to be brought back into the fold of the Lunder Institute, of this Maine community, and to witness today how it has grown and invited new conversation. The Lunder Institute at its inception had this idea of what is the role of an academic museum in redefining the core of its mission. So the Colby Museum of Art, looking at American art, what is American art, and challenging this definition with artists, learning with and from artists all along. The poet Richard Blanco had already been in residence by the time I arrived, and I started my time at Colby working with artist Theaster Gates. Naeem was introduced to me after there was a rumor in the art world about Naeem's work, his film work, his reputation, the way that he researched, his rigor, but also the way in which Naeem's practice allows us to return to some missing narrative and how this true line of restitution becomes an active act of memory building and language building in his work. And so as I'm being introduced to this most recent body of work, I recognize you, Naeem, and I'm so excited to see how these questions or how these true line have been evolving in the past years. Our previous director, Sharon Corwin, had visited the Sharjah Biennial and experienced the work of Naeem. And I had seen some films of Naeem before. And it was through this conversation that it became very clear that someone like him, a thinker, a practitioner like him, a scholar like him, would be such an ideal candidate in thinking with us about art, about American art, about this very, very porous definition that we wanted to revisit together. And so the invitation, and if I remember well, Naeem, you may correct me, our first conversation were about your encounter with American culture and what had been a point of introduction for you, either in the way that storytelling or story building had been introduced to you. And I remember Sharon and I discussing a lot what it means to rethink this identity with an artist that wouldn't be born in America. And that was just a beautiful way to set the table for what this research and any kind of questions that the artist would bring to us would set the table for the years ahead. We started our conversation, and I hope you won't mind me sharing, around Stephen King, actually, and your relationship to Maine, to the place that we were in, had a lot to do with the fact that you were an avid Stephen King reader as a younger person, and that Maine occupied this place of fiction that had come across through Stephen King's novel. Is that how you recall this?
Yeah, I think I said something like, oh, all I know about Maine is that every Stephen King novel is based there, which later through Sam Scott's research, we found out isn't the case at all. And also, I thought every town existed and many of them don't, or not by that name anyway.
Well, yeah, along those lines. And this idea was, well, how could we use this as a point of entry to share who we are at the Colby Museum, but also to explore with you what could be a through line and an opportunity to circle back to some of the questions that are recurrent in your practice, but also how this invitation to really explore new ideas could open new discovery for all of us.
I will just add one thing as you're speaking, Daisy, this occurred to me. I think today, sitting in 2023, to talk about somebody, let's say, growing up in Bangladesh or India or Singapore or wherever, to say that they consume a American novelist or an American TV series is no longer extraordinary because of globalization of especially streaming media, at least for cinema, and then a globalization of a certain kind of taste, although, as I've also written elsewhere, there is a hegemony of what gets counted as global culture. The flow is kind of outwards, not as much inwards, or even now you'll see many works that start looking like here or elsewhere. But in the 1980s, it was much harder. The export wasn't the way it is. It was much harder to get things in. And Stephen King just stood out as somebody who somehow sort of penetrated, like some form of Gothic horror that somehow was arrived in South Asian bookstores, and I don't really know why. I didn't know him in advance. And, you know, of course, if that's your first introduction to American culture, you know, you have a vampires in the shopping mall introduction to what you think America and Americana is.
And to that point, I mean, it was such a wonderful first conversation, but this idea that this type of fiction was actually some of the first image or the first step to spark your imagination as you project what this place that we're in could be, just felt like a really fitting point of entry. Some of the previous research that we had done with Theaster, Concern, and that might be a good place for one of the slides. Concern is work within American archives, so working with the Johnson Publishing House.
Sorry, I think we had this one additional slide.
Okay.
So
the next one. It's the next one.
No, but this moment of friendship is worth pausing on.
Pandemic friendship. Yes.
Exactly. Yeah.
En route to Colby, perhaps.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, so we had worked with Theaster and his work, this piece installed in the lobby of the museum titled Facsimile Cabinet of Women Origin Story, which was a work that was shown in his Black Madonna exhibition previously shown at Kunstmuseum Basel in 2018. What you're seeing is actually a cabinet that was built after the design of the artist with local Maine builder, and that contained approximately 3,000 images from the Johnson Publishing Company. Johnson Publishing was the company founded in 1942 that was behind Ebony and Jet magazine. And for Theaster, this exploration, this ongoing research into Black American archive in general, is a platform for self-healing, specifically when we think about Black American and the way their images or their story are being disseminated or erased. And so there was already a precedent as to how do we think creatively, but also in a very active way about the role of the visitor in re-entering some narrative like this one, but also our role as an institute, as a learning and research institute, into following artists into new venture as they are exploring new material. Maybe there's another slide. Oh, and I would be remiss if I would say Taj Brown, the students that we see in the photo, was such an active participant. Students engaged just because people could touch the work. You could pull out photos and create your own sequence of images on the shelf of the cabinet. There was a deep sense of community that was built out of this project, but also connectivity. Everyone was part of the story, part of writing this visual story. And Taj, who was a museum intern, took it upon himself to be a very active activator of the archive and introducing people to this work and really engaging museum goer in a very thoughtful and warm way around this work. And so I'm explaining this because that set the table for how we would think about community building and how we would also allow ourselves as an institution to introduce at times more complex or more nuanced conversation within the lobby of the museum, outside our walls as well. Theaster's long-term residency at the Lunder Institute was also focused on his introduction to Malaga Island. So friends of him introduced him to this island on the coast of Maine that had a very tragic story and narrative that scholar like Myron Beasley had addressed, artist Daniel Minter as well. But during his time at Colby, really explore the archive of this island that was originally composed of a mixed race community of a fishing family that were expulsed from the island at the beginning of the 20th century. I think it's 1912, and just kind of reckon with the history of Black people in Maine and how some part of this narrative had been obscured and erased as well. And so through his research, through the work of scholar and collaborator, this idea of land ownership, themes that are present in this practice came back to the forefront and allow for an entire body of work to be developed in response to this site, to this time in Maine, to this time that was really focused on rest and research. And that was also at the core of what the Lunder Institute aimed to propose and aimed to offer to artists, a site of respite where new question or more complicated question can be tackled, and how could we be at the service of these ideas? And so this is a little bit this is the precedent in which we invited Naeem, this idea of building community, of discovering community and building bridges as we kept redefining who and what we would be as an institution and as a partner to artists.
That's great, Daisy. Thank you so much. And I'm going to stop sharing if that's okay.
Yeah, of course.
And I think it's a good segue to all the work that you did to help Naeem be connected to the Colby community and to begin to do this research in this grounded way, both in the context of the US and the idea of America, but also within the context of Maine. So this very Maine-rooted project that he was interested in pursuing. And to do that, you helped him to connect with two people on the screen. So I'm wondering, I could think, Maple, I thought we might ask you to speak a little bit about your own research and the conversation that you and Naeem have had through this project, and how it has informed your thinking and the dialogue you have had in the context of how this project has evolved.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Thank you, Beth. And thank you, Daisy, for introducing me to Naeem. I had been a bit aware of his work, but I've come to have a deep appreciation for it since then, and have really just had a joyous time getting to know him over the last couple of years. So, yeah, I mean, we share quite a bit in common. We're both anthropologists who are preoccupied with questions of utopia, with questions of how to reconfigure and reimagine utopia in the wake of the sort of collapse and dissolution of third worldism, as well as of international socialism. I just showed Naeem's film, Abu Ammar is Coming, yesterday in my Visual Ways of Knowing class, which is a beautiful short piece on the complicated politics of trying to remember Bangladeshi volunteers, Bengali volunteers in the third world anti-colonial struggle in Lebanon and Palestine. And so when I started to look at Grace, and when I first encountered it, I thought of it as a real departure from those political concerns and as a much less political work than his previous work. But then I'll just, in the last couple of days, reflecting about the conversations we had together as Naeem was developing this project in Maine, I've started to really reconsider that appraisal of Grace. And one of the reasons is, I mean, it's worth reflecting one of the early conversations we had, because I think, Naeem, when you were first imagining this, you were imagining something more in a Gothic horror kind of vein that you would make. And in one of those early conversations, I think we talked about the fact that my early years were spent on a commune in northern Maine that was only a few miles from the road that inspired Pet Sematary by Stephen King. And some of my very earliest memories were, cradling a dead pet that had been run over by a logging truck on a road only a few miles from that one. And if there's any set of ideas that animate that novel and the film, it is, I would say, the horrible consequences that can emerge from humans being unwilling to accept their mortality and the mortality of the loved ones around them. Then I was starting to reflect on the horrors we're enmeshed in now as we're caught up in the dreams of various oligarchs to live beyond their mortality, to extend their lives out onto other planets at the expense of wasting this planet that we live upon together. And with those reflections in mind, and it's worth noting that what allows the sort of source of immortality at the heart of Pet Sematary is the ubiquitous 1980s horror motif of an indigenous burial ground, right? It's a Wabanaki Mi'kmaq burial ground there that's being used for settler eternal life. And when I watched again Grace yesterday, the video, I was just struck by, and I was struck by this initially, but didn't really think through its full implications. But Karen is so matter of fact about her physical decline. She is so what's so refreshing and moving is that she's not in denial, as so many of us are, about her mortality. And I think about that image that we opened with of her in the natural burial ground that she's chosen for herself and her mother, which is, and the willow casket that she was buried in, with the very intention of being returned to the circle of life and accepting that circle of life. It just seems like one of the most beautiful rebukes of the demonic dreams of immortality and the awful things that are done in the name of refusing that. So thank you so much for this work.
Thank you, Maple. I want to, that you provided an excellent segue to Sam, but I'm wondering if maybe we should show the videos now, the clips, Naeem, do you think?
I think also because why would be a good segue is because Maple just mentioned the burial ground, and the two clips we have, one of them is from the burial ground. So do you want to share? And you just have to click on the share sound as well this time, since we have the video.
Yes. Oh, okay. I hope I'm going to know how to do this. We'll see.
So let's pause here and then we can go to the video, which is the next one. Just to say that also how the relationship with Karen changed. At the beginning, a year ago, when we started and we spent many hours just talking and recording, she actually asked me to photograph her hands and to just have the camera there. Because I remember she said at some point, I don't want people to think that this is what cancer looks like, so it can't happen to me. And I never really actually knew fully what she meant by which part of herself she was referring to as this. But, you know, one of the evolutions is that over time, she, I think, leaned further into, no, if I'm going to be living my life in an authentic way, I'm not going to hold anything back. So you see in the film that gradually the camera, with her permission, progresses to, you know, her face and her whole body. And, you know, she becomes more matter of fact about referencing the decline. You know, she here, her shirt is pulled up all the way to the edge. And there's a clip that will show that's after the opening of the show, and she talks about how she doesn't want to do that anymore, how she, you know, it's just an evolution of her relationship to people being able to see it. So maybe we can go to the next clip, and I think if you click on it, it should work.
Yeah, love it.
You can't really tell the sleeves were, you know, and it's no secret why people are there. You know, it's they know that I have cancer. They can see the film and figure that out. So, and that was the first time I used a cane. And my mother died at 92 and didn't use a cane until she was like 90. Was so mad about it. And she had that 3-prong one. And she was always a really fast walker. And she hated that she put down one prong and then felt like the other two were tripping her. So most of the time the cane was up in the air. And that was not my experience last night. It was like, I use for this cane.
She's referring to last night being the opening, where she had taken the cane with her just in case. If we go to the next screen, that's the video.
Yeah, love it.
Sorry.
You can't really tell the sleeves were.
There we go. So it's a short excerpt. If we could play that, that's from the burial ground.
This will end up like with a ring of stones around it.
Yeah. Why? I don't know. It's a rock person.
And when did your father pass away?
2000. I don't know. I'm going to say about 10 years ago. I can't say for sure.
So your mom, when she passed, where is she now?
She's in my brother's house somewhere in a biodegradable ashes box because everything here has to be biodegradable. So I have my casket is made from willow branches. Very pretty. Goes with the woodland theme. So, but he just purchased whatever the box, you know, to make sure it qualifies for the cemetery guidelines, like no ornamentation, no, you know, it's got to be all natural.
So no ornamentation.
You can't be embalmed and be here. You can't have, like the casket I have has wooden nails or it's woven.
Mhm.
The Orthodox Jewish caskets also are permissible because they use wood for nails.
From here, you wanted to go to her office, right? Or,
But no, we don't have to do anything now.
okay, she came.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, the plan was that we would go if I thought I would drop it off because I know she's aged. She looks great though.
Right. Yeah, it's heavy, so I'm glad she has her
Mm.
son.
Yeah, so that's a small part of the scene, and you can see her mixture of just humor about the situation, including she goes into a whole riff about how the burial ground is set up, and very matter of fact about the process. I'm wondering, since we just saw that clip of Karen, Beth, whether we could switch the order and talk to Jan briefly about the process of finding Karen, because that was crucial research that Jan was doing. Jan, if I could ask you to share with us just the process of how you found Karen first and the research you were doing before that, before you got to Karen.
Yeah, absolutely. I remembered when we first started, we looked at a lot of paperworks, like law acts and like kind of like amendment like proposal, things like that, very factual, like objective and like historic kind of narrative. And then I click on the website of Maine Deaths with Dignity, and there's that subsection with stories that's from people and their families who have chosen deaths with dignity, like as their end of life approach. And there are very like intimate like interviews and like story sharing in that section. So I wrote an email to reach out to Valerie, who I think is also here with us today in the audience. And she responded to us and connected us with Karen, who I remember her. There are like 3 articles on the Maine Deaths with Dignity website with titles "Making Peace with Life Through Death" and just like part 1, part 2, part 3. And as we read through the articles and with Val's help get connected, like in contact with Karen, we kind of moved a bit away from the macroscopic approach, and now to hear a very like close up, like face to face, like conversation and friendship you develop with Karen. So
I think there's a way that, what you just said, that we moved from, macroscopic to the individual is connected, I think, to what Maple was saying, that he's familiar with my earlier works, which are, macro in scope, transnational movements, multiple countries involved, etc. And there was a way that when Jan and I were first working together along with Beth, we were also still, I think we had a comprehensiveness desire that let's look at this entire space and let's look at many people, as if somehow, and that's on me to have had that orientation in a museum, you need to be comprehensive of showing all variations. And once, Jan found Karen and we had the first phone call and Zoom with her, I think both Jan and I felt we can just stay with this person, and she's so funny, she's so warm, just, like, why would we want to go anywhere else? So we had the research, we still have the research, but we just said, okay, we have all this, let's just stay with Karen. And that's what we ended up doing for a year. Yeah. Beth, maybe we can transition to the earlier stage of the project, which was Sam.
Right. Sam, I think, it was so important to have you involved in the project, and Daisy, I think you found Sam because of his tremendous interest in Stephen King. And didn't you go to Colby because of Stephen King? Wasn't that there was a certain fate?
attraction for Maine. Yes.
There was. Yeah, and it is, I would like to start, it's such a phenomenal thing to see what this has become. From the first conversation I had with Daisy and Naeem, which was, I was of course delighted. They were asking me to read more Stephen King. That was, a joy. But it evolved in a way that was both lovely and entirely unexpected, even when I was doing very different work on it. And I think that where Naeem and I started was a shared interest in the kind of myth of Maine. The idea of, Daisy used a really apt phrase earlier of narrative memory. And that was a through line that I think Naeem and I were both interested in, especially something so rooted in geography and in where at least I was at Colby, unfortunately, Naeem. Naeem and I, actually, fun fact, have never met in person. And here we are. And
Pandemic life.
right. And so it goes. But yes, and so we started with Stephen King and realized we had to go a bit earlier, and ended up looking at oral histories, poems, petroglyphs, short narratives, short fictional narratives of indigenous tribes in Maine. And one of the things that we found that I like to believe is a through line to what the project became, is a sense of constantly in Maine, despite a history of rather brutal violence between colonists and indigenous populations, and then blossoming into something supernatural and different in Stephen King's works. There's always seemed to be a sense of real peace and dignity around the idea of death. And so I found before tonight a very brief poem, if that's all right, if you will all indulge me, that is from the old indigenous oral histories that Naeem and I were looking into. And it summarizes, describes the death of one of the famous and great indigenous men who had, despite the war and despite the violence, been doing acts of charity and acts of great things and kind things and graceful things. And it is untitled, but yes, thank you for humoring me while I read this short poem. The feast was ended. Bird and beast were slain. The dance was danced, and every rite performed. And gathered around the summit of the mount, the stately, silent sachems stood intent on Aspinquid. Thus he spoke to them his last words of love and counsel. My race decays, and I have lived too long. My limbs, with 90 weary winters' strife, are spent. My fathers call me unto them. And here once more, on Agamenticus, my old ancestral powwow's sacred seat, I turn to join my kindred Sagamore and fly before the doom I could not escape. Again he spoke, light not the fires of vengeance in your hearts, for sure the flame will turn against yourselves. Be prudent, wise, and always slow to strike. And with this advice, he left them. And I found that, I found myself remembering that upon watching Grace, that poem specifically, and this idea that Naeem and I had traced of, despite violence and despite age and despite inevitable, whatever that may mean, there is always time to settle, and that was lovely. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Sam. I think we have a few more images to share, and I think it will give anyone who hasn't had a chance to see the exhibition to see a bit more of it. We can talk a bit more. We have questions coming in, and Yen and Sam are going to manage those for us. So I'm going to go back to screen sharing, and we'll all be in communication as I do that, and we can move forward in that way.
And as we get the questions from Yan and Sam, we can also, any one of us can respond to it, I think. Maybe Yan, do you want to get us going?
Yeah, sure. Of course. I see there's questions coming in talking about like touching upon the macro scope of view like idea we just mentioned. There's one question from Janet saying, I know that Karen had psychedelic experiences to help her prepare for and accept her impending death. I don't recall Grace touching on this, and I was wondering, how did you decide what about Karen's experience to include in the film and what to leave out?
Thank you. That's a question from Janet. Who is also, we know Janet, she's daughter of Karen's partner, Charlie. Yeah, she did have indeed psychedelic experiences. I think it was a decision based on the fact that Karen and I spent a lot of time at home, in her home. And when we went to one of the places where she was, allowed, or where she could get items that we needed for the psychedelic experiences, it was actually kind of a decision based on the fact that we had left the home, the comfort of the home, and just the way those encounters went. There were a lot of people, just people who were at the same venue, who were talking to us while Karen was going about her work there. And honestly, it was left out because those were scenes where Karen's talking, I'm filming, I'm talking, but there's just a lot of other people all around. And so that's why we just opted for the quieter scenes. And I have to say, you said, how did you decide? But Karen and I decided everything together, just because that's the sort of process we had. And, she would look at clips with me and say, oh, did I really say that? I suppose you can include that, but let me listen to it one more time and then decide if we should, because she was also very frank. Yeah, so that's why I didn't make it in, not for any other reason really, other than wanting to privilege quieter moments in our conversation. But thanks for the question, Jen.
I'm going to keep moving slides forward, and we can always move back, but just so that we get a chance to show some of these, showing views of the exhibition as we have this conversation, and continue it and open it up to the participants, the guests, as part of this conversation.
Actually, Naeem, I've got a question for you of my own. Something I was curious about, something I had been reflecting about in the last few days, watching Grace a few times. And a big part of the research you and I did was, I think, really tied into the preservation of stories. And as we both kind of mentioned, this idea of Maine myth. And I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit to the idea of what was it like, and what does it mean to you to be responsible for the preservation of this story, to see this story continued?
It seemed quite easy and light, or evolving and happy and cheerful while Karen was around. I think you kind of touched on the paradox that she had been prepared for 4 years, and everyone around her was prepared, or at least spoke out being prepared. And somehow, I don't know, I hadn't prepared at all for a temporal state where this exhibition is open and Karen's not. And I always thought it's really her process that I'm really, I felt I was really opening up a space, making space for the story that Karen already wanted to share. And so it's definitely a shift that I haven't understood, or not that I haven't fully come to terms with yet, of telling Karen's story when she's not around. I think even the gesture of having the photo behind me during the Zoom of, Karen pointing to the work is me trying to say, but Karen's going to tell you about the exhibition with her enthusiasm. And now there's a cut, which she always told me and told all of us was going to be. She was very clear that, well, yeah, I probably won't be there for the end of the show. That part she was clear. So yeah, it's it's definitely a strange experience of having to hold the stories. And, Maple talked about the macro stories, those macro histories, those macro films, so many of the people there are long in the past, right? You're bringing in the archive for the first time here. The whole process started with Karen, and then I don't know what happens when there's not Karen. And yet it's a process that always had the knowledge of Karen's goodbye at some point already in there. Yeah, so you can tell I'm not being able to be articulate in summarizing it, because it's all like a jumble of contradictory feelings inside.
But thank you.
Oh, since this slide came up, I just wanted to mention one thing before we go to the next question, is that this is a series. We only did one for the show, but one of the many things that Karen and I talked about were she was making lists of books to read. And I once said to her, what are the 10 books you really want to read in your time that you have? And she, of course, had, in a very Karen way, multiple lists on Amazon, all of which she shared with me. And then we talked about, and then we get to 10 books that she really wants to read or reread in the case of Ibsen. And so this is a drawing of the cover and then a little quote. And then the rest of it is actually Karen talking about, that book, and also how it intersects with her own life and her feminist consciousness. So there are 10 such books. We hope to do the rest of them as well. Yeah. I think I see there's a question from Val. I don't know if Jan, do you want to walk us through that one?
Yeah, sure, of course. Val has shared her reflections on the death and dying discussions in the current world we're now having. Val said it is now too easy to talk about our mortality in general terms. It becomes impossible, though, to avoid vulnerability and authenticity as we're talking about them. When we choose to focus on the very personal and unique aspects of a single person's life and death, it really gives us meaningful moments like to slow down and actually process the feelings. And kind of based off Val's reflections, I'm personally also kind of wondering, how do you see grace as meaningful or as communicative to people who have, or those who haven't had the chance to process the loss of their loved ones, or their friends and family who are really close to them?
Yeah, thank you, Jan, and thank you, Val. That's Val Lovelace, who was our original link and introduction to Karen. So really glad she's joined us. You can see actually some of this, at least on a very personal level, in the video, because I talk about my father, who I lost in 2021. And the thing that we hadn't said so far, but I may as well say it now, is that many people lost a parent in circumstances that may not even have been COVID, but were in a hospital, beset and crumbling in the face of the pandemic. And that happened to my father. And I was actually in Maine on one of my research trips when I got the phone call from my mother in Bangladesh saying that my father was ill again, and she felt he needed to be taken to the hospital, which at that point is the thing you're trying to avoid. You really don't want to go to the hospital. And so I actually left Maine, drove back to New York, and then flew to Bangladesh. So there's a way that the Lunder Institute project, Colby College, all of that was right in the center point. And suddenly, I was in the middle of my research and in this other and suddenly left and going back to Bangladesh. And that was my father's last journey. And so when I came back, one of the reasons, of course, that Jan and I started working together on this specific aspect is at that point, I felt I couldn't think of anything other than these experiences of mortality that I had gone through. And in the video, you see me talking to Karen about my father every now and then. And that was not something that was meant to be in the video, or I wasn't even thinking about it, because we're just recording our conversation for hours. And at some point, I needed to share what was happening to my father. And some of it was, I think the undertone was that I wish my father and my family, we had a different kind of situation to choose an endpoint, at least an endpoint that doesn't end up with being in a hospital where you can't even see your loved one. And in the end, some of that is in the video because it's also in the middle of a point that Karen's making, so it just stays on organically. But that's how it worked for me, being able to, it doesn't bring my father back, and it doesn't give him a different outcome in terms of his last days. But it was a way to process it. And I think Karen would make a lot of space for you to talk about whatever you needed to talk about. So, yeah. That is a scene from the show, which is a different film that's set in India. It's a fiction film set in a hospital, which is about a couple that refuses or decides to leave the hospital. Fiction film based on some experiences I've also had. But the one note I'll say about this film is it was written and shot before the pandemic. But then once the pandemic happened, there was no way to even have a separate space from it, from the pandemic conversation. And so it became very strange to talk about the idea of declining medical care at a time in the pandemic when we were all trying to get all the care we can get, at least in terms of the politics of vaccine access between the first world and the global south. Yeah, I think there's a few more images from the opening.
Naeem, can I ask you a question as we're looking at those images? Yeah. I would like to ask about the process. We see in Grace, Karen, Beth, and yourself in the vault of the Colby Museum, a space that we never see when a visitor comes into the museum. And so from a very personal standing point, I love this idea of not only the very intimate relationship that we get to witness, but access to space. Can you talk about the curatorial process, building this exhibition? We see you looking at object, but at its heart, curatorial work is about care, it's about stewardship. And I think there's some beautiful theme in how you came to this idea of having Karen curate an exhibition. And I wonder if you can say a few words about this, just about what
sure.
the exhibition represents. Yeah.
And I think it would be great also, I'll say a few words, and it would be great if Beth could also join in, because she was integral to it and I think guided us in a very gentle but generative way. Yeah, there was the center, so there's a film on the left with the hospital and then the video on the right with Karen's story, and there's a center room, and that became the space where we proposed that Karen could curate a show. And at the beginning, it was very broad. Why don't we look at the Colby College collection? But, she had such a high energy mind. I mean, no sooner was that word out of my mouth and Beth had agreed to it conceptually. Karen had already gone off and done all this research on the website, including looking at databases I at that point hadn't known existed, and came back a week and a half later armed with this whole list of things that she had actually found on the Colby College website. So that's how the process started. And then it became this quite layered, step-by-step, and Beth also talked about it, of what are the themes and what is the difference between something you like and something that's available. There was an early, because Karen was doing so much photography, there was definitely, she loved the Salvatore Mancini photograph. Actually, she said, this girl with the dress reminds me of myself, not just at this age, but later on, because I was such a free spirit. She compared herself with this girl in the photograph. We had three themes and the walls match up. One is beginnings is the first wall. The second wall is outside. And the third wall is goodbyes. And so there is the theme of, Maine nature as it's depicted with all its complications. Beginnings is much more of a human set of images, and then goodbyes are mourning rituals. And Karen had actually researched and found, a show on mourning rituals that had happened at Colby College a couple of years back, and then said, I'd really like to, the one on the left, Marissa with a dog under a tree. She was finding out things. She had been to this show at Colby College, and I think she hadn't known Bernard Langlaise when she first started the process, but became fascinated by him also. And then I think the thing that was the second or third layer is, what Beth referred to. Maybe Beth, you could tell us more about that, which is that you can like something, but then the exhibiting of it becomes a third or fourth layer.
Right. I mean, Daisy, it's a really good question, because it really goes back, Naeem, if you may remember, we started talking about the Colby Museum's collection because we were talking about, you had the Stephen King project was going to be called America is Hard to See at Night. And Maine's a very dark place. We're very lucky to still have dark skies here, but that also had lots of meanings, of course. But we started to talk about how you might potentially work with a collection. So that, I think that was the initial seed of this. And then I think when you started to be in conversation with Karen, and she had such a clear, I mean, she was a joy to work with because she had such strong opinions about what she wanted, and she had and the curatorial themes it was, you know, she also talked about folk art and so her interest in folk art inspired, you know, I sent her our Bernard Langley catalog. She'd not heard of him before, but his interest in folk art, although he would not have defined himself as a folk artist per se, then inspired her to learn all about him. And there were a number of works by Bernard Langley, but she could also, you know, when we looked at the painting on the right there, you know, she would talk about it as a composition. This is inside and outside, and she would talk about her connection to nature, but also her close, the way she loved home. And I love that she chose the image of Helen Langley reading. To the best of my knowledge, we had never had this work on view. That was another thing. She and Naeem wanted to find things that had never been or weren't exhibited frequently, and certain artists, sort of big name artists, came off the list for that reason as they did the editing process. So for me, it was just a joy to witness and to learn from Karen and Naeem as they made these choices and shaped this vision. And then that continued in the installation period as well. When I'm not sure if we have any more. No, that's an image of, these are from the opening. But when we were installing, we would bring Karen in and Naeem at this point via screen. We were using Zoom to zoom them in and make decisions about how we placed things. So she remained very involved all the way through it, and did a pretty good job with a gallery talk too during the opening.
Thank you both. It's just so moving, I guess, to think about this co-authorship and this act of weaving this narrative together and what remains. I love that now these objects in the collection have also carry that story as well as theirs. So yeah, I just thought that was a beautiful gesture as to how this research came together and was made tangible and visible.
Yeah, thank you so much, Daisy. And I just wanted to add, you know, just to witness, you know, a project evolve. And we talk about how obviously we work with students here at Colby who are researching things, scholars who are researching things, and then artists also, like that research can be done by anyone, and that a project can evolve in a collaborative way, and to see the work that artists do as a very special way of researching and beginning a project and bringing voices in, and the way that this project evolved to have all these interconnections is I think a beautiful thing and very inspiring.
Beth, I noticed that Elizabeth Chapman who's a friend of Karen, has written something, and I think similar to Janet, she's written something about which she has much more experience than me. And I see in the technology that we are able to actually turn the mic on and let someone speak for a minute. So I wonder if I can have your permission to just let Elizabeth speak, because what she's brought up, I actually would not be the best person to speak of. If it's okay with you, Elizabeth, I can just turn the microphone on for you, I believe.
If you know how to do that, Naeem, I actually don't, or Ben Pinkham, who's behind the scenes.
Yeah, Elizabeth, I think you can speak if you would like.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I'll just say that Karen shared extensively a shamanic practice that she engaged in of journeying. And she studied it with many people around Maine, and journeyed for herself, and she journeyed for her friends to help heal them. And she healed us. And it seems to me she prepared herself by journeying to what it would look like and feel like when she's no longer living. What will that experience be? She journeyed to communicate with the cancer itself, with her ancestors. And I postulate that some of her comfort, her capacity to be calm and poised, came from building a bridge that she went back and forth across numerous times. And it's a thought, and there might be other people who have similar experience with Karen's really quite amazing capacity to shamanic capacity. And that's really all I have.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I think some of that was also there in the burial ritual. And I think the burial ritual was also planned by Karen quite precisely as I experienced it. I wonder if Janet wants to say something, because Janet's also has intimate knowledge. Janet, I don't know if you wanted to say anything about what you had brought up earlier, about which you know more than me. You are muted, however.
I think Elizabeth said it much beautifully, and she knows a lot more about that than I did. We did talk about the psychedelic experience, but I don't think I have really anything to add.
Okay, thank you for your question. And Janet, just to answer your question about where are the other 9 prints, they are going to be made in the summer, and then all 10 of them will be donated to the Colby Museum, hopefully. At least there's an offer to donate it. So we wanted to do all 10 in time for the opening, but then we thought the works that Karen had chosen should be centerpiece and not be overwhelmed by 10 new works. So we just put one in the corner. Also, we never got to this, but Christian Gobo wrote, just want to add that I too was oddly enough drawn to Maine and Colby at first because of Stephen King, haha. So that's, I guess, another student. Yeah.
Well, I'm mindful of the time, and I am with just so much gratitude for to all of the panelists, and especially to you, Naeem, and to the friends and family of Karen Wentworth and everyone who was able to join us this evening. I also want to thank Ben Pinkham of Monmouth Audio for being behind the scenes, and Chris Berquist, our curator of education, for organizing this event. And finally, I wanted to mention that next Friday night, March 3rd, we will have a very special First Friday at the Paul J. Schuff Art Center, which is a new gallery where the Colby Museum has a new gallery. And we recently opened a new exhibition there. So for additional information on that, you can find that on our website. Thank you again, everyone, and take care.
But I think there's one more image if you wanted to show that as we say goodbye. Or 2 more, actually.
Thanks, everyone.
That's the vault.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing.
Thank you, everyone. See you in real life when the snow passes.